You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your warrior host, Abraham.
And I am your politician host, Shane.
Sure. We are a psychology podcast, and we talk about all of the weird and wacky things that humans do. Sometimes we talk about diagnoses. Sometimes we talk about governments. Sometimes we talk about hot-button political issues.
Mm-hmm.
And today we're actually talking sort of about governments. We're talking about a historical group of people with a very unique culture.
Yes, we are talking about the Spartans. And the reason that we are talking about the Spartans is because we are here celebrating our 300th episode.
I can't believe we made it to 300 episodes. That is wild. This seems very out of reach not that long ago.
One thing I will say is that we have consistently put out an episode every week for 300 weeks. Is essentially what that means.
That is exactly what that means. We're coming up on 6 years of doing this thing. It's just pretty cool. It's all very exciting. So thank you for joining us. I appreciate you being here. If this is your first time, then cool. Great time to jump in.
Yeah.
Whether it is or not, it doesn't really matter. If you would like to support us, you can do that a myriad of ways. You can buy some merch. You can join us on Patreon. You can like and subscribe where you listen to podcasts. You can petition the government to start a national holiday called Why We Do What We Do Day or something like that.
Why we day what we day?
There you go. But I'll talk more about how you can support us at the end of this discussion. As we said, because this is our 300th episode, we figured it would be fun to talk about Spartans. And in case you're like, what does 300 have to do with Spartans? It is because of the 2006 movie called 300 that was about Spartans.
Yes, that seemed to be in the zeitgeist for quite some time. And that particular movie and the comic book that's related and all that stuff, people might think it seems to be like an over-fictionalized kind of ridiculous take on Spartans, but it's actually not that far off. I mean, there's probably less sepia tone.
Yes.
At the time that Spartans existed. But there is, at the very least, a lot of stuff that they pulled were directly from historical events that have happened with Spartans. So I think that's part of where this came from as far as the topic goes. But also, I think there's a really interesting thing to talk about within this, and that's the idea of cultures and behaviors around specific cultures that have certain values. And that's kind of where this discussion is going to go, is from a historical accounting of this kind of the society to why they did what they did. It's a fun way to get there, I think.
Absolutely. Now, this episode does come out on February 8th, and February 8th has some holidays to acknowledge. One is that it is Opera Day.
La la la. Yeah, if you you can go watch your favorite, like I mentioned earlier, before we were recording, we can go watch our favorite Bugs Bunny cartoons where he does dress up and sing opera, which is wonderful. It's also National Molasses Bar Day, which sounds tasty.
Yeah, I'd be interested in, I don't think I've ever had a molasses bar, so maybe today's the day.
Sounds very Southern.
It does sound Southern. This is a fact. It's also Laugh and Get Rich Day. Now, I was curious about this because I wanted to suggest that people laugh and get rich, but I wasn't entirely sure what that meant or how to coach or direct someone to do that sort of thing. And so in reading about it, it really seems like what they mean is get rich emotionally by having a rich experience because you're laughing. Or maybe I misread it because I was skimming over to just get a sense of what it was. But that was my interpretation.
Yeah, it seems nice enough, I think. It's also National Kite Flying Day, so if you enjoy that type of thing, you could go do that. There's also a band called the Kite Flying Society that you could go listen to they were an early 2000s band.
It's kind of a surprising, it seems like early February is not like a great time to go fly a kite. Maybe in southern states, but in a lot of the United States, that's still pretty cold most of the time.
Yeah, it was. Well, I mean, if it were International Kite Flying Day, I think we could make sense of that because there's the entire southern hemisphere that's not celebrating winter right now. So I think that'd be fine.
Yeah, it's also Feeding Tube Awareness Week. So go be aware of our GI tube friends.
Yeah. It's also National Bird Feeding Month, which is not related to Feeding Tube Day, so...
It's not. But you could go to the opera with some molasses bars, laugh and enjoy the fact that you're there, and maybe try and make it an opera about the kite runner or something.
That might work, I think. It's a quiet day. Well, this is going to be a quiet day in February, I think, for everybody.
All right. Well, we're actually talking about Spartans, as we mentioned. And before we get deep into this topic, there is sort of a trigger warning here. We will be talking a little bit about bad things happening to babies. So if that's something that you struggle to hear about, then maybe sit this one out. It is early in the episode, so you could skip a little bit past it, possibly. But that is a thing that happened a lot in Sparta.
Yes, so there's not a ton of it in this episode, but there's enough of it. So we've thought it would be important to kind of share with y'all. One thing that we learned, specifically Abraham doing the notes for this, we learned that the Spartans and Abraham are on polar opposite sides of what we would describe as humanity.
Yeah.
They are nothing alike, except for maybe the sarcastic jibes and the languaging. I think that might be maybe something where you can relate to, but everything else is very different.
I would agree with that assessment. Yes. Very little overlap in what I value or who I am and who the Spartans were. In kind of like all ways and like not always the great, like, although I'm appreciative of who I am, I would love to look like a Spartan. You know?
Yeah. I mean, it's I believe you look like a golden Adonis, but I guess everybody else has a, I guess it depends on how you look at you, I guess.
Yeah, I look great through rose-colored glasses.
First of all, again, this is 300 episodes. So we started covering Spartans because of the movie 300 and kind of wanted to unpack that. Essentially, the questions that we're trying to ask are, who are the Spartans? What makes them unique? And how accurate was the movie in the story 300? And I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised with all of those things.
Yes. And slightly horrified at some of them.
Yeah.
In multiple ways. Okay, so let's get to some basic background stuff, understanding just what was going on in Sparta. Sparta was the city-state. It was reportedly founded around the 9th century BCE, about 2,800 years ago, if you're trying to do the math. And it lasted until about the 4th century CE. Now, another source that I found did suggest instead that it started 6th century BCE to 2nd century CE. So we're looking at a range of, depending how you define it, around 900 to as much as 1,500 years where Sparta was in existence.
Yeah. And so, like you said, Sparta was a kind of a city-state, but it was located in the southwestern Greece area, right on the Evratus Potomus River. And it was on a large piece of land also inhabited by other Greek city-states, which sat right out in the Mediterranean Sea between the Ionian and the Aegean Sea. So there's a lot of water. There's a lot of like kind of port and trade and stuff happening for the city and these other city-states.
Yeah, this particular part of Greece, it's kind of shaped like France, if you've ever seen how France is shaped, but it is connected to a mainland, so it's almost like a peninsula, but it like gets really large on one side of the peninsula. I don't know.
Yeah.
But that's sort of what it looks like if you're looking at it. Now, there is like where Sparta was, people have rebuilt. There's like a city there, and I think they even maybe still call it Sparta, but the original version of it obviously is, there's not much left of that.
I think if the culture persisted, there would be some problems.
Yes, that culture wasn't going to make it pretty much by design, but they did last a surprisingly long time, all things considered.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Now, one important thing about Sparta is that for pretty much its entire existence, it was a military oligarchy. And just in case you're unfamiliar with those terms or that idea, a military oligarchy is essentially a military state or a martial state or a government ruled by martial law, basically. But it was even more of like a martial oligarchy than you might think if you didn't know very much about Spartans. Like you might think, okay, so it's a bunch of army captains running the government, which is true. But to Sparta, war was like the only way of life. That was the only thing that mattered.
Yeah, and you're going to see how that informs all of their behavior. So here's a quote about this. Quote, "The Spartans did not dabble in warfare. It was the pursuit around which all culture, education, relationships, and politics was structured and disciplined," end quote. And that comes from a source, McKay in 2021. So essentially, everything they did, everything that they worked towards, everything they strived towards was really about warfare, going to war, preparing for war. I mean, it was war all the time, like the Thursday album.
Yes, exactly. I mean, a lot of other Greek cultures were often battle ready, considered themselves very good warriors and that sort of thing. But in Sparta, that was the way of life. And they very strategically structured their government so that the people who were considered Spartan citizens, like that was what they did. They were they were all professional soldiers. That was how it ran.
Yeah, I would say the equivalent is like there are a lot of guitar players in the world, but there's only one Eddie Van Halen.
Sure.
Like they were virtuosos at war. I mean, it's like they were experts. Like it's like there's a difference. Like there are good guitar players, and then there was Eddie Van Halen. There were good warriors, but then there was Sparta, and that's kind of what we're looking at here. Is like this entirely different level. Like this was a mastercraft for them.
It really was. Yeah, that's actually putting it extremely well, is that this was, because it was their singular focus, they were extraordinarily good at it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So let's go ahead and get into Spartan culture and really talk about what was so unique about them besides their, and including their war-oriented mindset. The culture was war and preparation for war. That was what they did, right? And because of that focus, because of that priority of it being war ready and battle ready at all times, Sparta had this very unique culture and laws relative to other places in the world in some kind of surprising ways.
Yeah, so for one thing, the Spartan government was run by a very small number of what they described as elite citizens, and Spartan citizens were very free and in some ways very progressive.
Yeah.
So the government was smaller and it was run by a few people, but although many Greek poets and authors at the time criticized the Spartans for being boorish, aggressive, and hateful towards education, available evidence suggests that not only were they literate, but had a public education system and made literacy compulsory for citizens, including women. So everybody in the culture was educated and involved in that public education system. Most everybody.
And actually, most of them were educated in also the arts, some music and dance and poetry and sculpting and stuff like that. That was considered part of their education. And in fact, speaking of the Spartan women, they were actually educated in a somewhat similar way to the men, at least with similar content. I mean, the men were, like, again, their primary focus was being ready for battle, but women were also actually trained in weapons and military combat. Like they were much better at it than you might find a normal, like what your average Greek city state. You were unlikely to find women there who were ready for battle.
Right.
In Sparta, you would only find women who were ready for battle because of it.
Right.
But in addition to that, they were literate. They could independently own and manage property, and they were actually relatively free with their sexuality.
It was unlikely that women were allowed to directly participate in government or politics, which, is a different concern. But it was not considered inappropriate for them to be able to choose sexual partners or even to leverage their sexuality to influence politics indirectly. So, which they reportedly did. So there was a lot of freedom and kind of like almost like a free love type of society when it meant that what they were doing would better serve the community or something like that. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing because you didn't really hear about that in other parts of the world. I mean, it was, if somebody was messing around with somebody else or like they were choosing their partners and they were kind of thrown to the wayside and they were considered the dregs of society.
They had quite a bit of independence, which was surprising for that time in history. And they even in some cases would rule over other men. So like a woman could have the highest authority over other men in Sparta. And so that's kind of a unique thing as well. There was a quip about this that they pulled into the movie and I think the graphic novel where they asked originally, I think the historians report that the question was, how is it that Spartan women can rule over other Spartan men? The response was something along the lines of, because only Spartan women give birth to real men or something of that nature.
Yeah. And what you'll find later as we go forward is like that tracks with like how they respond to a lot of different things.
Yes, it does.
They're very snarky people.
They are. Okay, so we'll keep talking about some more of sort of how the government and the culture was set up after we hear from these Trojan ads. Okay, we're back. Let's talk about the sort of caste system of Sparta.
One thing that's important to note about the Spartan culture was that the vast majority of Sparta were perioeci, or craftsmen, and the other group in this culture were enslaved serfs, which they called helots, who were responsible for farming and construction and other activities that helped maintain the state. So Sparta was not necessarily free in terms of what we know today. Like, there was still slavery.
Yeah.
But the citizen soldiers, which, was a redundant term because all citizens were essentially soldiers, were also called hoplites. They enjoyed more freedom than they would have in other Greek governments at the time. So you'll find that there's a lot more freedom for the people who were considered the free citizens, the soldiers of the state.
Yeah.
The government also used strict laws and powerful secret police systems to maintain the concentration of power and control over the city. So there's a lot of this is where the deep state started. No, but this is where there's some interesting deep state stuff, kind of like those secret police systems that exist.
Yeah, they didn't want, because they were vastly outnumbered by people who are not the citizens, they didn't want them to rise up and take over. And so they had this very nasty system of sort of keeping them tamped down so they could remain in power.
Yeah.
Which is, not great.
Yeah, not good.
The Spartans were also reportedly very religious and superstitious. They would constantly consult with oracles on nearly every decision that they made. They frequently consulted mystics about omens and interpretations from the gods. And there were even reports of instances where they might forego battle if it was instructed that the gods did not will it so, or that there were bad omens for a battle. So although they did primarily ready themselves for battle and frequently participate in warfare, they also, because they were so superstitious, were easily influenced by things that the mystics and the seers might report.
Right, which I think, if I'm going to armchair psychologist this for a second, I think it makes perfect sense when you have a group of people who are war is such a pride, like an act of pride, right? Like, it's such a prideful thing, and the last thing you want is to go into a battle and lose, because it's not going to look good for your warrior culture, right? So I'm going to avoid it if it doesn't feel good.
Yeah. That's true.
All right. So to be a Spartan citizen soldier, although enjoying many rights, it was not easy. Spartans were really parents.
Yeah.
So Spartans actually practiced one of the most aggressive eugenics programs of all time. So Spartan babies were brought before a council and evaluated for physical fitness. So I first picture a baby just being totally ripped, just kind of doing a lot of the fitness poses, and they're like, yeah, that's a Spartan baby. And then every other baby's like, okay, that baby can't lift a sword. Well, we gotta have a talk. So they're evaluated for physical fitness. But if a Spartan baby was deemed weak, deformed, or otherwise unfit, it was abandoned to either die of exposure or to be adopted by strangers. And there was a suggestion that, you heard kind of stories, they threw them off a cliff, but most historians believe that this was just kind of an exaggeration or just an outright myth. Even if they were allowed to live, the ones that were deemed physically fit and ready to become a citizen soldier, they were subjected to a lot of tough love. And so we're going to talk about some of the trials and tribulations that these kids go through to survive in this culture.
Yeah, some of it was systematic, but the overall sort of general cultural practice was that this was the tough cry it out. So Spartan children were ignored when they cried. They were taught to not fear darkness or solitude. They were routinely beaten or flogged. They were hazed, and they encouraged children to haze one another. They were ridiculed if they ever showed weakness or if they were also physically unfit. And then they were sometimes deprived of food, and they were served sort of carefully rationed portions.
Yeah. So again, not really the easiest place to grow up, No. Now, there was this process called diamastagosis. And it was a brutal endurance test, which adolescents were severely beaten as a measure of their endurance and resistance to pain. So they went through kind of almost like this really intense kind of ritual hazing.
Yeah.
Some of the beatings even resulted in death. And this practice gradually increased in brutality by the time Sparta was in decline under the rule of the Roman Empire. It had turned into a belligerent blood sport. So it went from being something that was somewhat controlled and kind of a rite of passage to something that was just even less fun than it was to begin with.
Yeah, snuff for the sake of snuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, I struggled through that one.
Yeah, I think it's a hard thing to talk about in general. You're like, I don't want to say this.
Yeah, well, and then the other thing too is I don't know if it continued to be adolescence over time, but thinking of this annual tradition where you beat someone to death just because, it seems pretty gross.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about one of the more famous parts about Spartan childhood, I guess, and their culture in general. At the age of 7 until about the age of 30, Spartan children, the boys, were famously put through a training ritual called I've heard it pronounced agoge. In modern English, the recommended pronunciation was agoja, which does sort of fit the phonetic patterns. As I said, this was the boys. The girls actually did go through an intense training and education period. They just didn't go through the same one that the boys did. And anyway, for the Spartan boys, the Agoja was the state-run program designed to train them in military exercise and also ultimately promote what they called moral citizenship, for whatever that might mean, looking at Spartan culture. And for the first 5 years, so starting at age 7 until the age 12, for those first 5 years, the children stayed in a communal barracks and they were trained in all kinds of things. The primary focus, of course, was warfare, but in relation to that, they were also taught to be stealthy. They were taught athletics. They were trained to hunt, but there wasn't all aggression. They actually did other things as part of the Agoja. They were also taught scholastics, philosophy, politics, and some of those rhetorical and sarcastic retorts. And there was a lot of that back and forth.
Yeah, so the Agoja was intended to teach self-discipline, self-sufficiency, obedience, endurance, and courage. So there were kind of these pillars of this process to help build up this person to be a well-rounded Spartan citizen. Maybe not a well-rounded citizen for other places, but they were going to thrive in Spartan. So
yes, exactly. As we mentioned, so that was the first 5 years. Once they turned 12, then they ramped up the intensity. The kids had their clothes taken away. Instead, they were given a single red cloth, which apparently they got a new one every year, but that was it. They didn't have any clothes. They had one red cloth, and they were forced to sleep outside, so they had to make their own beds. They were given meager rations and sometimes no food at all, and were instead expected to find their own food. And that could include hunting and foraging, as you might imagine, but it was actually specifically expected that they would steal their food. But as part of this, they had to be stealthy when they were stealing their food, because if they did get caught stealing, then they were punished with a serious beating, because they were essentially, the society did not condone stealing. They would punish stealing, but they thought it was so important to be able to be stealthy that they wanted the kids to try and steal for food as long as they didn't get caught.
That is the worst. That is thinking, right. I mean, it's a bad situation in general, but I could understand that for a warrior culture. So much of it is not just brute force. So much of it is intelligence. It's political maneuvering. It's politicking, all that stuff. But then the stealth part of it is also very important for certain wartime activities. So it makes sense they'd want them to be stealthy too.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so as they grew up into adulthood, they were further instructed in politics and rhetoric, and the Spartans actually valued the idea of a less is more type of approach. So in fact, Sparta was part of a region called Laconia, and the term laconic comes from the tradition of saying little unless it was important to say, so people of few words.
Yep.
And Spartans practiced jibing each other and responding with quick, witty retorts, and there are several humorous reports of things said, some of these that you'll probably be familiar with.
Yeah, there was a couple from, at some point, there was a King Philip II, I think, who kept trying to invade Greece and Sparta and that sort of thing. And he sent a message to this, reportedly, this is sort of legend, but reportedly sent a message to the Spartans that he sort of intended to be kind of a coercive and a threat. It said, "If I enter Laconia, I will raise Sparta." Now, there were different interpretations of this. Some of it was you will be enslaved forever, or I'll burn your city to the ground, but the same sort of sentiment communicated. So if I enter Laconia, I will raise Sparta. The Spartans reportedly responded with a one-word answer: if.
Which is honestly pretty great. I really like that one.
Yeah.
So there's another message. As King Philip II continued to try to expand his empire, he sent another message to Sparta asking, quote, "Do you wish to enter his kingdom as friend or foe?" End quote. And the Spartans returned, again, one word: neither.
Yep. We're not entering your kingdom. So
that's my favorite. Is it's check one box, yes or no, and they're like, NA.
Yep, exactly.
I like the idea that maybe came on a stone tablet or something, and they had to chisel in the extra box and just neither, and how much time it took to do that.
Yeah. That's pretty good.
Obviously, there was paper at the time. I don't want to say that there was a paper. I know that, but I like the idea of them chiseling that into stone.
Good clarification. Yeah. So apparently Sparta did not have like the large sort of castle or city walls you might have seen around another large metropolis or city state. And when asked where the walls were, King Agesilaus, however you might say that.
Something like that.
He pointed to the Spartan soldiers and said, "They are Sparta's walls."
I like that.
Sometimes reportedly he just pointed and said nothing.
Yeah, I kind of like that. I mean, that feels like very like, it feels very machismo, but also it feels like pretty badass. That's a great report.
Yep.
All right, so this one might be familiar, and this was portrayed in the movie 300. When Persian Emperor Xerxes demanded that Spartans relinquish their weapons, Leonidas said, "Come and take them."
Yep.
That feels pretty good.
When the Athenians complained about how few Spartans were assigned to a battle, they did depict this in the movie, although I actually think this was a totally different commander in a totally different time.
Right.
But they did depict this in the movie. But apparently at some point the Athenians complained because the Spartans showed up with a force of people numbering smaller than the Athenians. And they were like, "Hey, why'd you bring so few soldiers?" And the Spartan commander asked the Athenians, they said, "All the cooks stand up, and then all the potters stand up, and then all the farmers stand up," until at some point everyone in the army had stood up. And then he turned to his army and he said, "All the professional soldiers stand up," and all of them stood up. And he turned to the Athenians and he said, "I brought more soldiers than you did."
That is depicted in the movie too, and you're like, okay, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
And this last one too, which is also a report, when King Leonidas was warned that the Persian army shot so many arrows that they would blot out the sun, he returned, "Then we will fight in the shade." So, Again, you can kind of see how, like, they're very confident people to the point where all of their sarcastic jibes are, like, really pointed and probably infuriate all the people that they're dealing with.
Yeah.
Like, I could not imagine being, like, a king being like, "We're coming to get you," and they're like, "Maybe."
Yeah. It was very much represented that they would not say something unless they could sort of do a turn of phrase or some kind of witty quip or something like that. And they didn't just talk to talk. Again, part of why they're very different from me.
Right.
Who I do.
I like to talk.
One of my jobs is to just talk. That's just the thing I do.
Yeah. So we're just gonna we're gonna draw the contrasts of Abraham and Sparta for the rest of the episode.
We'll also contrast the quality of this episode with the quality of the ads that you are going to have to listen to. Okay, so let's return in talking about, again, we sort of were talking about the rhetoric and the politics that were part of the training that Spartans went through. And as they were getting into their 20s and their adulthood, they would be trained in a lot more of the sort of politics end of things. But again, warfare was their bread and butter, if you will.
Yeah, so the emphasis on battle readiness cannot be overstated. Okay, I mean, this is not like an over-exaggeration. This is absolutely like the core of the culture.
Yeah.
So to be a Spartan citizen was to be battle ready. And a typical Greek soldier might prepare and train during the spring and summer a dozen or so times per year, but a Spartan citizen trained 200, 400, even 600 times in a single campaign season. Being a Spartan citizen was being a full-time soldier. That was the job. That was the role. That was your caste in society.
And you said that well, that they really did. They sort of saw battle as a job. And actually so much so that they really disdained if they saw a soldier running enraged and sort of berserk, all angry and emotional going into battle. There was like, what are you doing? Like, calm yourself down. To them, war was second nature. It was a habit, a routine. And when you fight with a cool, focused mind because you're doing what you've been trained to do your whole life. And it should be a sort of calculated, measured, intentional activity, not this impassioned, emotional engagement. So it's kind of interesting in that way.
Yeah, you're clocking in. Like, I'm not writing a report at work going like, yes! So like, it makes perfect sense that they would, like they do the same thing. I mean, there's been times where I've been really stoked about a graph that I put together, but like, I'm not going to freak out about
Same.
it. Yeah. Their fighting was also very unique. The hoplites were all considered to be equal to one another and did not have many ranks beyond a commanding officer. So I think that's pretty unique, especially when you're talking about a military state and a military regime.
Yeah.
You don't see that now. There are lots of ranks and lots of commanders and lots of kind of like levels to this thing.
Yeah. So when they were fighting, they would form this phalanx. This had been in existence before the Spartans, but the Spartans really did kind of perfect this. And this is a military formation that the hoplites would create, in which their shields would overlap to the left. So they would overlap the shield of the person on their left to create what sort of functioned as a nearly impenetrable barrier. You had just wall of metal being held back by people who were tightly packed together and bracing on one another. Mm-hmm. And that made it so that it was very, like, you couldn't, even shooting ballistics into it, it was hard to get anybody. You couldn't poke spears through it or swords through it. They basically would slowly inch forward and just stab you in the face with a spear. And that was kind of what they did.
Yeah.
Is they had these little cutouts on their shield where they could poke their spear through. But otherwise, yeah, they would just sort of push through and slowly advance and protect themselves as they went, and that made it nearly impossible to do anything to them. And when they moved, they would switch into, so there was two formations. One was that sort of standard like overlap. When they moved, what would actually happen is the right side of the line would advance before the left to create sort of a slanted cascade of shields, and that again allowed them to move where they could maintain that barrier consistently, is by having it sort of follow that cascade.
Yeah.
And that was called immediate order. And that allowed them to to make their advancements.
Yeah, super interesting. Now, they largely fought with spears, but they also used short, double-sided swords when up close. So they had no problem getting their hands dirty when it came to that type of fighting. So, I mean, it makes sense from a strategic standpoint. Use a spear so you don't have to get close and risk your body. But then when you do have to get close, at least you've got something that's just as deadly, if not more.
Yeah, and when asked about it, they made some joke about that they fought with short swords so they could get close to their enemy.
Uh-huh.
And I think that probably it was a matter of practicality. I think, as you said, when you want a little bit more distance, they use a spear. But if they're going to be up close, they want to be able to wield be very agile with their weapon and wielding their weapon.
Yeah.
So something short and very, very sharp and dense was a little bit more preferred. And so, yeah, they had these little swords. I forget what the name of them was, because there's like a name for the shield and a name for the type of sword that they used.
Right.
But yeah, they would get right up there and just start mowing people down.
Wild. And they were incredibly proficient at this. I mean, we're going to see this in the next segment here, but they were incredibly proficient at this. I mean, they were specialists.
Yeah, they really were. And I think even most other Greeks recognized, like, they would talk down on them and how dumb they thought that they were, even though they really weren't. They were actually very intelligent people. They just were very singular minded, if you will.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But the other Greeks knew how good fighters the Spartans were. And the Spartans would often boast that one Spartan soldier was worth like 5 of another army. So,
yeah.
If they were outnumbered 5-1, then they're like, perfect. That's about exactly about the odds we need.
Yeah, exactly.
To have a good chance at winning this.
Yeah, and they demonstrated that time and time again. That wasn't like an exaggeration.
Yeah, they were legitimately incredible soldiers. Speaking of which, let's talk about the Battle of Thermopylae.
Yes, so the Title 300 from the movie that people kind of got introduced to Spartans were, this actually comes from the Battle of Thermopylae, or the Battle of the Hot Gates, where there were a small number of Greek Spartan forces, mostly Spartans. They held back a vastly larger army. And so, like, what was depicted in that movie was obviously a fictionalized version of it, but it wasn't far off from what actually happened.
Yeah, so the Persian Empire had been attempting to expand into Greece for a while. Before Xerxes, who was the emperor of Persia, and he was the one depicted in the movie, the former emperor Darius I had sent heralds to persuade several Greek city-states to simply concede to their rule and to be ruled by the Persian Empire. Just said, basically, they went to the Greek leaders and they said, hey, give us some earth and some water, and that will be a sign of your submission to us as your rulers, and we'll leave you alone. They'll just be, when we call on you, we'll need you. And
yeah,
we'll also probably take some of your food and stuff. But otherwise, you are ruled by us now, and you can do what you're going to do. There were some of those Greek city-states that accepted this offer. However, many of them refused, and specifically in Athens and in Sparta, the heralds that they sent to ask for food and water were killed. Mm-hmm. Apparently, the Athens threw them off a cliff, and in Sparta, Leonidas has rumored to have said, come and dig it out yourself, and then threw the heralds into a well.
Yeah, so that's a historical report that is very clearly depicted in the movie.
Yes.
When Xerxes became emperor of Persia, he continued his mission to expand into Greece and marched into southern Greece. He sent heralds again, but this time he skipped Sparta and Athens and decided to simply invade. So he wasn't even going to give him a chance. He was just going to kind of walk right in. He was going to come dig it out himself.
Yeah, he was. All right. So Xerxes, they'd been basically marching along trying to accumulate a large army, and successfully so for a long time. The Persian Empire was getting very large at this time. And he commanded a massive army of estimates range from 70,000 to as many as 300,000 fighters. Some sources do estimate it being even higher, but he was commanding a gigantic army.
Right. What's interesting too, like you'll see this a lot with like empires that grow, they will take resources from other parts of their empire and they will use that. Like, I mean, when we talk about the Persian Empire and you see kind of depictions of elephants and stuff and discussions on that, that was pulled because their empire was so large, they were able to use those resources. Same thing with the Colosseum when they would bring like different animals into battle into the Colosseum. It's because their empire was so large, they were able to take animals from different parts of their empire and bring them in. So that's kind of a unique thing.
Right.
Now, Sparta and the Athenians and a few other city-states assembled about 7,000 men to go defend against this oncoming army. So you're talking 10 times at the minimum.
Yeah.
The Persian army is outnumbering this group of people.
Yeah. The best odds that you can estimate are that they were outnumbered 10 to 1.
Yeah. Exactly.
And it could have been much, much worse than that, how badly outnumbered they were. So basically, this battle took place at Thermopylae, and that's because the land itself had sort of had this natural barrier that forced Xerxes' traveling army to walk along the coast between the cliffs and the ocean. And it got increasingly narrow at this one juncture called Thermopylae, or the Hot Gates. And it was this narrow pass between the ocean and those steep cliffs. And it was apparently reportedly only a few yards wide. Like, we're talking very, very narrow there. And it was along this path that Xerxes was attempting to enter southern Greece. And so it created a huge bottleneck because you just can't fit very many soldiers through at a time.
Right. And so then the Spartans actually formed their phalanx in the narrow pass and prepared to defend against the oncoming Persian army. And I think this is one of those things that when we talk about military expertise, this proves the expertise and the preparedness of the Spartans versus the Persian army, which was kind of an amalgamation of like larger groups of people kind of just figuring it out as they went. I mean, you had this group that was like, this is how we do this. This is how we defeat this. It was all strategy here.
Yeah, they knew that basically if they could fight them from one face, they weren't fighting them, on the north and south and east or getting outflanked or anything. If they could do basically a face-to-face confrontation, the Spartans were in pretty good shape to be able to take out enormous chunks of the army. And they were right about that. And so the timeline suggests that this lasted anywhere from a few days to maybe a week or something like that. But what we found is that most sources suggest that it mostly or very likely happened around this order. So day one, the Spartans successfully hold off the advancing army, killing thousands or tens of thousands of Persian soldiers and only suffering a small handful of casualties on their end.
Right. On the second day, the Spartans continued to cause massive devastation to the Persian army and again, only suffered minimal losses. So again, remember, they are defending a spot. They're not necessarily moving forward. They're just kind of there and they're just like wiping out everybody that comes into contact with them.
Yeah, they've got like 7,000 soldiers. At this point, they've absolutely destroyed a huge chunk of the Persian army and only have lost I saw reports of like a few hundred people had died on the Spartan side.
Right.
But it was like for everyone that died, they'd taken out like 50 soldiers,
Right.
Something like that. Like, it was crazy how effective they were at maintaining their space. And this was because of their phalanx strategy. So, unfortunately, by the third day, a Spartan trader whose name was Ephialtes apparently went to the Persians seeking reward and informed them of a pass, another narrow pass, that would allow them to outflank the Spartans, basically get behind them and attack them from behind by using that pass to lead some of the Persian army around behind the Spartans.
Right. Now, aware of their position and kind of this issue of the pass, Leonidas dismissed most of the army and stayed behind with 300 bodyguards to cover his army's retreat. So that's where the 300 comes from.
Yes, and that number seems to be fairly consistent. Some suggest it was 288, where there was two people who had like a mission, but it does seem like 300 was likely the number of people who stood to cover the retreating army and save them, including the king himself.
Yep.
And again, to them, this was considered a great honor.
Right. And there, the vast Persian army overran and killed all except one Spartan who was instructed to carry the message of the defeat back to Sparta.
Yeah. All right. So that is essentially the Battle of Thermopylae. And so that does all of this, I think, then sort of speaks to the accuracy of how this is portrayed. And we'll dig into a little bit more of the specifics on that after you hear some ads for spears.
Or 300 ads.
Or ads for 300. Okay, so we're back. Let's finish up this discussion and sort of comparing the events and the culture of Sparta as depicted in the movie to what actually happened. And we've sort of been doing that throughout, but we'll do a sort of one-to-one shot here.
Right. So if you've seen the movie 300, directed by Zack Snyder, then you will have recognized several pieces of history that line up with the scenes in the movie directly. I mean, you're talking about shot for shot, line for line, what has come from legend has gone and made it into this movie.
Yeah, and so 300, as we mentioned, it's based off a graphic novel of the same name by Frank Miller, so it's called 300. The movie came out in 2006. As you mentioned, it was directed by Zack Snyder and starred Gerard Butler, Lena Headey, and Michael Fassbender, and just many other people as well. Like, there's some big name stars in there. And as you also mentioned, features a lot of sepia tones.
Yes, it's very golden.
Yeah, amberish sort of colored.
Yeah. I mean, it's beautiful. It's beautifully shot. It's very, like, if you've seen a Zack Snyder movie, it looks like a Zack Snyder movie, but it's done really well. And it was the first one that he did that everybody was like, what is this? So, yeah. Spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it, it's 2006, it's almost 20 years old. 300 is about the battle at Thermopylae and depicts King Leonidas as a child going through the Agoge and growing up to become the king of Sparta. And Persians send diplomats to Sparta and are thrown down a well. That's like arguably the most famous. This is Sparta. He kicks them. Yeah. They fall down the well. Like that's, and then this goes on. The Spartans in the movie march to fight off the Persians and inflict heavy damages until they are defeated. It follows a timeline like we just talked about.
Now, much of what they show of Spartan culture, what they imply, way that they sort of rewrite or they add their own sort of embellishments, it actually was fairly accurate in the film to some of the things that we've talked about, in particular showing some of how that culture worked and a lot of the demonstration of like their sort of witty responses and sarcasm and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. There's a line that in the movie that I really like that I'm like, it wouldn't surprise me if they actually said something like this. Is in the movie, Xerxes says something about the women and children, and he said, like, clearly I should have marched the women down here to fight you based on what I've been seeing of you, your soldiers, something of that nature. And it's like, that's very much, I think, something that Spartans would say. They would often disparage their enemy by comparing them to the women anyway.
Right. So the Spartans themselves in the Battle of Thermopylae, they actually sent more than 300 soldiers to battle initially, but they ended up leaving with those last 300 as like a protection and kind of a final stand.
Yeah, but some of the things that the Spartans said or did in the movie were based on the historical reports of actual events. And we already mentioned the one where the Spartans did throw the messengers into the well. It's likely that Leonidas said, come dig it out yourself rather than this is Sparta, and also probably physically threw them into the well rather than kicking them, although that was a cool scene. Yeah. Actually, the idea that the Thermopylae happened during the celebration of the Carnea was accurate, like that was going on at the time.
And then the phrase, then we'll fight in the shade is directly lifted from historical references. I mean, that is said in the movie, and it is such a great line, and Gerard Butler delivers it so well, but it is one of those things where you're like, yeah, that's lifted right from historical context.
Yep. When asked to lay down their weapons, they say, come and take them. That was also something lifted from the reports from history.
Now, it was unlikely that the Persians were able to bribe the oracles against the Spartans. So that's something that, because the Spartan culture and like the Spartans were so deeply religious and spiritual, that the oracles were so important, it was very unlikely that happened.
Yeah. Also, Ephialtes, as depicted in the movie, he is very deformed and has a lot of physical deformities. And I think that's meant to sort of be a physical representation of betrayal in a way. But it's unlikely, like he probably was just a normal guy and was not deformed and angry about not being allowed to serve in the Spartan army, just sort of a greedy, selfish person.
Right. Or just fearful, too. I mean, it could be any number of things, right? Like he was afraid that they were going to lose, didn't want to die. So, Now, the Persian army was not likely as large as depicted in the movie. In the movie, it is a little bit bonkers. Like, it's made to look like they can't be defeated. Yeah. And there's a giant pyramid, like Xerxes is standing on like a giant pyramid they're carrying. Like, it's like a whole thing. So, it's like a giant chair.
Yeah, and the largest distinction where I think the movie was the most wrong was the depiction of the Persians, as you said. These were not weird, monstrous, exotic savages obsessed with hedonistic pleasures and like mutilating their soldiers or creating strange goat people chimeras. Yeah. That was just not a thing. They were just people. They weren't monsters. They didn't make monsters or mutilate people into monsters. They were just people that had largely been gathered by the Persian Empire as they went around trying to expand their rule.
And so with that being said, like, I mean, otherwise, most of the kind of depictions of the Spartan culture were fairly accurate. And if you kind of retroactively watch the movie and you see, like, you know, the idea of the movie is it's a story being told by another Spartan, right? The messenger that's left, right? The one that loses his eye.
Right.
And so it makes sense that like some of the depictions would be a little bit fantastical and some of the Persians would be described as monsters that were defeated and all that, because it is kind of like a folktale in the movie, you know?
Yeah. All right. Hey, Shane.
Yeah.
Why did the Spartan go to the gym?
I don't know. Why did the Spartan go to the gym?
To train for the ultimate workout, war.
Oh my God. There's so many of these. This is so good.
So we decided to ask ChatGPT to write some jokes about Spartan culture and Spartan soldiers and that sort of thing. In case you're not familiar, ChatGPT is an open source AI in which you can give it writing prompts and it will generate text for you. And so I asked it to write some jokes for us. And I thought it'd be fun to read a few of what it came back with. So this is a computer's interpretation of humor about Spartans.
Yeah, there's quite a few. What's the one that says, like, how does a Spartan make toast?
It was, how does a Spartan make toast? By raising their wine glass and shouting for glory and honor.
Yeah, like it's you could tell the computer was trying. It just did not land every one of them.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. Some of them too are just like statements. They're like, "Why did the Spartan go to the beach to practice beach landing tactics?" I'm like, yeah, they might have.
yeah, that's actually like pretty accurate. I think the one that like got me, that really caught me for a second was, "Why did the Spartan cross the road?"
Why?
To conquer the other side.
Yeah, that was pretty good. There was, what do you call a Spartan who can't fight? A liability.
Yeah, that one's pretty good too. That one totally, and that is like, that feels like it was written by a Spartan.
Yeah, very much so. Okay, so anyway, there's lots of those. It was fun. It was a silly time. If you join us on Patreon, and anybody who's already listening to us who is on Patreon, we'll post the rest of the jokes that we got from ChatGPT, so you can see what it came up with, because they're pretty ridiculous. That'll be available there.
Yeah, they're pretty absurd.
Yeah. But otherwise, yeah, I think sort of my general take-homes are just in describing this. Spartans were very unique, and one of them was that their obsessiveness with war as being the only thing that was really, truly important, it kind of made some space for some really interesting sort of societal developments that you might not have seen in other Greek city-states at the time, including a relatively large amount of freedom and equality among people who were citizens, including women, and a large, like, sort of demographic of people you might not otherwise expect. But they did do that also by treating their subordinates terribly.
The big thing I would maybe pin down from like a behavioral scientific view is that with them being so focused on war and preparation for war and all of that, it makes sense that all of their behavior would surround that and all go to serve warriors and making sure that there was strength in that. You know, their politicking was probably very refined. Their jibes, their jabs, their sarcasm was all very refined, under the kind of the motivation that we were always going to go to war and we are always prepared for war and we are this culture. So like everything they did was informed in some way. Having serfs and slaves were designed to fuel the war machine.
Yeah.
Right. We have enough resources. We have enough food. We are creating enough. The craftsmen are developing weapons more than anything else. I mean,
yeah.
And if they're developing anything else, it's so that we can continue to harvest so that we can feed people who are going to go to war.
Yeah.
So like, it just seems like that, like singular minded, that value really informed so many of the behaviors that were occurring in that culture, which I think is really, really fascinating, because if you look at like kind of the United States today and you want to compare and contrast, there's so many other things. People can make the argument that we are war minded, but there are so many kind of like specialized jobs and specialized values within this that it just seems very unheard of.
Yeah, I agree. And another thing, as you sort of were talking about that I forgot to mention earlier is, and related to this, is that even their clothing was kind of a relatively important thing. Like the very iconic Spartan helmet with kind of the mohawk that goes front to back. What I read was that partly that design was intended to create the illusion of greater height and appear intimidating and a little bit dehumanizing to the enemy. So they kind of looked monstrous and scary. Their helmets that they wore had just these small cutouts for their eyes, but had these very sharp sort of cheeks and the nose plates that covered so much of their face that they made them all look the same. And although they did not fight half naked as they did in the movie, where they basically wore diapers, they were actually wearing real armor most of the time. Their physical appearance was actually really important to them, not just in looking scary, which was very important, but also they did take great pride in being physically fit, being very muscular. They kept their beards very well trimmed so that because they thought that their appearance was very important, they would keep their hair combed, and it was considered very masculine to grow your hair out long, and that they should look sort of beautiful and handsome. Yeah. And women were actually very similar. Like they were in very good shape. They took really good care of themselves.
They kept their beards trimmed.
Exactly. And so there was this whole part of this that was also a bit of the vanity. But then they were kind of like also good at a lot of stuff. They got good at politics, they got good at music and dance and art and stuff, but that was all sort of a hobby you would do on the side when you had finished all your military training.
You know, it's funny to think about that, because when you think about like ancient Greek culture and all of that, I mean, so much of politicking and arts and music and literature and philosophy, and I mean, there's so much stuff that came out of all that. So it makes sense that the Spartan culture would have all of that, but it's kind of funny to think that like they got good at it sarcastically. They got good at it just because it was like a hobby. Like it wasn't like something that was like super important to them. It was just kind of like, well, we got to do this. It's kind of like a necessary evil. Like if I get good at politics, can I go stab somebody? Okay, good. Like that's kind of what it seemed like, you know, like it was important, and it was like it was required for their society, but it wasn't like, it was kind of a second thought or an afterthought.
Yeah. Another thing that we didn't really talk about much was just that the Spartan culture kind of declined as many large ruling countries kept trying to like invade and take over Greece at various times. And there was a lot of battles and that sort of thing. And many city-states did lose, including Sparta eventually did mostly fall, particularly when it was coming under the Roman rule. I mean, it was losing more. And also I heard that I couldn't find the source the second time around, and I found it originally, but a source suggesting that because of their intense eugenics program, they didn't grow very much as a society. And so the population wasn't getting a lot bigger. And as other countries were getting larger and the Spartans really weren't, and then as they were getting invaded, one of the things that the invading countries did was free their enslaved people, who again outnumber the Spartans considerably. So giving sort of a rise to those people made it so the Spartans didn't have the resources they needed either. So that seems to have been that they sort of both politicked their way out of existence and eugenics their way out of existence. Yeah.
They didn't do themselves any favors. So I guess maybe like the final take home point I would have here is that Spartan culture was super interesting, also not something to strive towards.
Probably not
an example of what you want to be or do.
Yeah. It'll be temporary if it does get there.
Yeah.
So
also not great for everybody.
Yeah.
Good for few people, but not great for everybody.
Yeah.
Great for more people than other cultures, but maybe not great for the vast majority.
Yeah, precisely. All right. Well, let's wrap this up with some recommendations.
Recommendations.
I am recommending a TV show. There was a TV show that I can't recall if it's getting a season 2. Anyway, it's called The Devil's Hour. I don't want to give very much away about this show, but it's a show where you don't necessarily know what's happening until, it's not confusing in a way. You don't see how all the parts fit together until you get to the very end, and then it all starts to click, and it's just really well written in that way. And I was actually really impressed with sort of how cogently and cohesively they tied the whole thing together, feeling like it was sort of one of those stories that you think about a lot after it's finished.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm recommending The Devil's Hour TV show.
I like that. I don't think I've even heard of it. So I'm stoked to kind of give it a look.
Okay. This is on Amazon Prime streaming. So if you have access to that, you can find it there.
I like it. So my recommendation this last week, I have been cooking more. Something I really enjoy is cooking, but I just don't have a lot of skills. So what I've learned is that I can pick up skills by, like watching a couple cooking shows and watch how people prepare things and cook things and describe things. So I actually really enjoy that.
Sure.
But one thing I have started doing in this last week has been using cookbooks. And so that's my recommendation, is use cookbooks when you can.
That's awesome.
So I used to use I have a book, Bad Manners Kitchen, which is like nice, easy. It's like really funny to read. Like there's funny stories in it. This last week, I made my first soup ever, like from scratch.
Wow.
Like a tomato soup from scratch. And that was really cool. And it was a lot of fun because I'd never done that. And you might be going, well, come on, Shane, everybody can make a soup. But like I'd never done that. So like it was an impressive feat. But I got a really cool vegan ramen recipe book, a vegan soup recipe book. And my son got me a Pokemon recipe book.
Fun.
Which every recipe in it is themed after certain Pokemon. So we're kind of going through, because the story is you got to catch them all. So we've caught 2 so far. We've caught Crustle and we've caught another one. So we made a vegan peanut butter chocolate parfait, and we also made that spicy tomato soup. So
wild.
It's been really cool. So I just recommend doing that. If you like cooking, it's a lot of fun. So go for it.
Super fun.
Yeah.
All right, great. Well, if you would like to tell us about Spartans and the movie 300, the graphic novel, and what we got right and what we got wrong, or if you'd like to tell us about a recommended common utility that you have available to you that maybe some people underestimate, or a TV show you've been into lately, you should reach out to us. Let us know. We like hearing about everything, particularly about episodes, but you can talk to us about our recommendations if you'd like.
Yeah.
You can email us directly at info@wwd.podcast.com. We're on most of the normal, not wild, crazy social media platforms, so you can reach out to us there and speak to us, and you'll engage with one of us. And as I was talking about at the beginning of this episode, you can support us. You can support us emotionally, physically, financially. One of the ways that you can do that is just if you rate the episode, give it 5 stars, or 4 if you're maybe not as satisfied, but 5 if you can swing it. Leave a review, subscribe, so that we are always showing up in your feed and you never miss one of our fun jaunts down history and historical fiction. Otherwise, if you would like to, you can support us financially. You can pick up some gear by going to our merch store. We got mugs and shirts and sweaters and beanies and stickers and all kinds of stuff. And if you're really in for the commitment, you can go over to Patreon. And if you join us on Patreon, you get some special bonus stuff because we're so appreciative of the commitment that takes. And it just really helps us do our thing. And speaking of which, let's thank people who have really helped us along the way. There's the Disseminating Behavior Analysis Special Interest Group, which has funded us a couple of times very generously. And then our Patreon supporters, which includes Amanda, Brad, the Daily BA, Joshua, Justin, Justine, Kelly, Kim, Kostia, Layla, Megan, Mike M, Mike T, Shauna, and Stephanie. You guys are awesome.
And we adore you.
I could not do this without my team. That is Alan, Jess, Patrick, and of course, Shane. Thank you for recording with me today. And Justin, without whom this would not be listenable as a podcast.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you guys for all the work that you do. And thank you for having me, as always.
Yeah, and thank you, listeners, for continuing to hang with us and listen in, because you give us your time, and there's nothing more valuable than that. And I'm honored to be able to speak to you and with you every week.
Yes.
I think that's all I have. I'm missing anything, or do you have anything to add, Shane?
I've got nothing else.
All right, then. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.